Welcome to the Breeio Acteon webinar, Finding the Human Focus in Virtual Classrooms. Really glad to be with you here today. And over the next hour, we're going to be talking about this human focus. But let's find out who we have with us today. First of all, you've got myself. My name is Jo, I'm from Lightbulb Moment, and we'll show you our pictures on the screen in just a moment. And what I'm doing here today is hosting the webinar. I'm making sure we have a little bit going on in chat and also kind of making sure to bring everything together towards the end. So do let me know in chat if you have any questions. And my focus for the last 8 years has been around virtual classrooms and webinars. We help teams of people design and deliver them. But let me tell you a little bit more about the other people that we have here today. We have Sarah. Sarah Whiteman is the head of marketing at Acteon and works closely with consultancy and the technology product teams. She's been leading the research work on virtual classrooms to better understand the experiences for L&D leaders during a period of rapid adjustment over the last year or so. We've all felt that. She's drawn on the industry research that's around and on client experiences, which I think is the really important bit to publish a new report on virtual classrooms. We also have the lovely Owen. Owen Rose is the managing partner at Acteon and leads work in consultancy and content development. He's been absolutely instrumental in developing Acteon's approach to creating engaging, impactful communication and learning solutions. And Owen's worked with a wide range of international clients in many sectors, and he's led the introduction of insights from behavioural science into L&D. So quite frankly, there is no arguing with him. He'll be sharing examples from Acteon's experience working in virtual classrooms. We're also absolutely delighted to be joined by Kath Adis from the BBC Academy, who will be sharing her experiences on the shift to virtual classrooms. And I'll tell you a bit more about Kath later on. And as you can see by the information on screen, we welcome your tweets today on #BreeioWebinar. Really looking forward to those. So moving on, we've got this webinar has really come about because of this white paper, which is based on research surveys from the last year, all about virtual classrooms. The webinar today will talk about some of the findings included in this paper, and of course we will share this with you at the end. So Sarah, can you tell us a bit more about what makes human connection a central part of learning?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just checking you can hear me okay?
Oh, I muted a bit too quick there. Absolutely, we can. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, well, I want to start with a story, and it's told in a TED Talk by author and teacher Azul Terenez. And Azul has been obsessed with a question, which is this: what makes a good teacher great? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So please share your thoughts, type into the chat. What do you think makes a good teacher great? Maybe it's somebody you remember from school for all the right reasons, who made a difference. What made them special? Jo, have you got any thoughts on this?
Oh, I think it's about stories. It's the people that bring things to life, and it's not just flat on the page. I was thinking recently, I'm getting into history, didn't like history at school, but it was boring. Now I'm all into the stories and how it links together. And in chat, people are saying a good teacher that's great is personable, adaptable. Love that adaptable point. Empathic listening. I can't even say that, Stacey. Stephen says good connection, empathy, no ego. Matt says stories. Cara says rapport and believing in you. What a lovely point. Maria says passion. Helen says stories told with passion. Passion's a bit of a theme coming through here. And Christina says being interested in you and making this relevant and relatable. Tell us a bit more, Sarah.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, Azul wanted to find out what kids thought of this question. So he asked thousands of students in all sorts of different schools and different places what they think. And he had lots of answers, but one he kept seeing again and again was this: a great teacher eats apples. Well, at first he thought this was just a silly answer and it's kids talking nonsense because they found it funny. But he heard it so often that he thought he'd try it out. So when he was teaching in school, he started eating apples all the time. He'd eat them at break time, he ate them at lunchtime, he ate them during lessons, and kids started giving him apples. So he would take them, and then they would smile, and he'd smile back. And the penny dropped. He realised that they wanted to give him a gift, and his acceptance of the gift was like an acceptance of them. It was kind of a symbol for their relationship. And Azul says there was goodness in that and trust. Obviously, we're not thinking about the role of a teacher in the same way today, but we are thinking about what it takes for humans to open up so that we're ready for learning and ready to be open to new experiences and knowledge. It's about building rapport, being willing to learn together, make mistakes together, share our ideas together, and even if they are kind of quote unquote wrong. And that helps with, it starts with helping people to feel confident enough to be a bit vulnerable and to trust in the people that you're with. So what we're really talking about are the bonds that exist between people and how those connections form an essential foundation for learning together. Sounds good. How do we relate this to the context for L&D that we're talking about today? So, and in particular, for our experiences in delivering learning in virtual classrooms. Well, I think it's helpful, first of all, if we just define what we mean by a virtual classroom. So typically for a virtual classroom, we're talking about small group replacing a face-to-face workshop. So we're talking about up to 12 participants, where there's loads of room for involvement, participation, interaction. And then we've kind of got a middle category, which I think, Joe, you usually define as about 12 to up to about 30 people, where there's still lots of room for participation, but it's probably a bit less individualized. And then we've got webinars, which are upwards from that, up to thousands, where and that's what we're in today. So in nature, a webinar is a little bit more like a conference talk. So there's of course room for participation in chat, but in a virtual classroom, there's a lot more potential for involvement and discussion and interactivity, and that's what we're focusing on today. So at Acteon, we've been running surveys over the last year alongside our webinar series that we've been running with Joe. And we've been asking about L&D experiences in virtual classrooms over that period. And my goodness, what a rapid transition that's been. But we wanted to gather insights into experiences in that period of time. So we asked facilitators particularly what you find hard in reading the room, in understanding how participants are feeling, tuning into their reactions and their responses, whether people are engaged. And we asked about using digital body language. So Jo is fantastic on this. She did a brilliant webinar for us and a previous one in this series on this topic. It's all about using the cues available to us in virtual environments to help us read the room. And we asked also about whether facilitators feel equipped to respond to that information. So if they do tune into participant digital body language, do they then have the tools they need to respond to what they're picking up from participants? And for very experienced facilitators and everybody, you've been telling us about wanting to kind of rediscover and trust your expertise and depth of facilitation skills in this different environment. It's rediscovering what you already know, but in a different context. I've been hearing from facilitators that you've been feeling increasingly well equipped in virtual classrooms, but there's also kind of challenges that are acknowledged. And it's around this question: are we still missing something? So these are real responses we had in our survey. Please type yes into the chat if I feel like there's an emotional disconnect. Building rapport is difficult. There's no informal chat like I used to get in coffee breaks. I can't see faces, I can't read expressions. How do I know if my pace is right? And this one at the bottom, it's hard to connect on a human level. So we might be feeling outside of our comfort zones, but when we really think about it, we do know that there are actually some advantages of virtual environments too. Like it's easy to take a quick temperature check using emojis and thumbs up and yes in chat. I can see, thank you, lots of you saying, yeah, I recognize these things. And there are other advantages, like maybe you can get more of your participants to share their thoughts. So it's not just those who are brave enough and mouthy enough maybe to put up their hand in a face-to-face workshop and speak to the whole room. Maybe more people are willing to engage and contribute. And of course, it's super easy to share and access other resources and platforms and tools. So the question is, how might we harness these advantages to help us feel more of that human connection in a virtual classroom? We've got 5 strategies, and we're going to talk through each, and we're going to give you some concrete practical examples. And I'm sure many of you are already doing things under each of these strategies. It'd be great to hear your experiences too. So please do feel free to add your comments into chat as we talk. So the first strategy is foster participation and connection. Well, why does this matter? Live in-person learning is our chance to bring people together and really learn from each other. We want to encourage people to participate, to interact, to be involved with their learning and really take ownership of it. And it's often when people talk about their own experiences and hear different perspectives from other people that it helps them to reflect and think about what they do, maybe to question their own assumptions. And as I'm sure you well know, we need to kind of create a safety so that people feel comfortable and open to sharing their experiences, comfortable enough to be ready to learn. That peer-to-peer learning is so important. So how do we do this? Well, it's at the start of a session and at the beginning of a session, and before even, it's about creating an atmosphere for learning and putting people at ease. It'd be great to hear from you. Are there particular things that you do to put people at ease from the beginning of a session? Please add any of your thoughts into chat. And as you're doing that, I'm just going to share a few thoughts here. So this might include setting expectations in pre-session guidance that we're sending out. So for example, if you want participants to have their webcams on, maybe it's helpful to let them know that in advance so that they come prepared to do that. And it's also important to think about how people feel when they first join a virtual group. Starting sessions with warm-up activities, getting engagement early really helps participants to feel that it's easier to be involved. So there's less of a barrier. Once they've done it once, it just is easier to do it again. And that can be something really simple, like just drawing on a whiteboard or saying hello or just typing into the chat. That early engagement is all important. Jo, are we hearing ideas in the chat?
We certainly are. Everybody, when you're using chat, please make sure you set the 2 to all panelists and attendees. So we're seeing your great comments and I will read them out, but not everybody is. So thank you very much for changing those. James says have the camera on when they join so they can see the trainer. So that's exactly what we're doing now. It's what I did at the beginning. There's a real human connection there. Have relaxed chat and an intro, be online early, says Mike, and pick up one-to-one as people join. Love that. Helen says build a connection, welcome people by name, which is so easy to do live online. You can say, hi, Sarah, hi, Kath, hi, Bob, and encourage unmuting, using of the chat box. You can use music, says Derek, and actually we've got something on music later on, Derek, so that's a really good point. We can ask them to turn their cameras on if they're comfortable to do that, if that's appropriate. Check people know how to use the chat, which is one of my favourite tools, which you'll know if you've attended any of my webinars ever. And use visual prompts from backgrounds to start the conversation. It's always a good one. Oh, what books have you got on your bookshelf? And even more. I think it's that whole point of connecting with people ahead of the session, isn't it, Sarah?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Thank you. Some really good, interesting ideas and examples there. Thanks for sharing those. Okay, so let's think about during the session. There's lots of different ways to get participants involved, as I'm sure you all know, but that engagement and interaction is critical. And I think there's a case here of us knowing the audience. So different groups will have different needs. A lot of that depends on the topic, and it depends on things like whether this is a one-off kind of short training workshop or part of a series where we can help to build those relationships between participants. It can be good to try different things out and experiment a bit, changing the group sizes in breakouts through the session, trying with pairs, with small groups. We'll hear from Kath in a minute about some examples of how she's done this in practice. And what are we asking people to do in breakouts? Sometimes it might be something really structured, like completing a template or something like that, or it could be very unstructured, like getting together just for a discussion. And maybe we can try introducing competitive elements like games, quizzes, which could be done in teams or individually. If you plant the seed at the beginning that people are going to be in a competition, maybe at the end, then it gives them an extra reason to pay attention. And then we want to be thinking beyond the classroom as well. And again, we're going to hear a really nice example from Kath of this, but do we have an opportunity to connect people beyond the virtual classroom, give them a way to share experiences and to support each other? So Jo, I think over to you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm really, really pleased. We've got a lovely example of this, and I'm delighted that we've got a guest speaker to talk about her experiences in this area. Now, Kath is a training manager with the BBC, and she specialises in training journalism and production skills. I trained as a journalist about 1 million years ago, so I'm very hot under the collar right now. And it's all for staff who broadcast on the BBC World Service and who are mostly based overseas. And over the last year, Kath has turned a largely face-to-face training portfolio into 100% remote offers. I'm sure a lot of us have had to do something similar. But Kath, please tell us a little bit more about your experience.
Yeah, so the people I teach, BBC World Service broadcasts in 41 different languages. And so my trainees are, as you said, based largely abroad, incredibly diverse culturally, linguistically, in terms of their educational background, in terms of their journalistic experience. So it's a very challenging group of people, very exciting group of people. And as you say, we had to really, turn on a sixpence last March, as everybody did, and turn our face-to-face offer into a remote offer. And I've been thinking a lot over the last year, how can we, in our virtual classrooms, replicate the sort of energy that we used to get in a classroom, in a face-to-face environment? When we might have 16 young Indian journalists in Delhi chatting to each other, really debating some sort of thorny editorial point. And often the energy was really palpable in a room. So thank you. If you could just show that slide, that would be lovely. Thanks, Sarah. So I've been thinking everything is really tied up together. And, so I think of gluing people together, making them feel comfortable, things that Sarah was just saying, making them feel that they're part of a group, making them feel that they're safe, making them care about the other people on the course, leads to increased interaction, and increased interaction leads to good learning. And it all comes back again. If people are learning, they feel connected with the rest of the class, and then they're happy to interact. And I teach in my suite of courses, we go from sort of one-off little workshops, maybe on interviewing skills, up to a 2-week-long course for new joiners to the World Service. And so gluing people together, of course, for a one-off event is much harder than if you've got them for 2 weeks. But I've been spending a lot of time thinking, how does this work? How can we get that energy up? And I think it's very important to also remember how people feel when they enter a virtual classroom. So when I was doing a Train the Trainer course recently, before we'd even really done any introductions, we went over to Mentimeter and I said, type in 3 words that describe your emotions at the beginning of a course. And this is what they came up with. These are quite senior members of staff, they're not new joiners, but even you can see here, there's apprehension, there's uncertainty, there's confusion, there's also some positive things. I showed this to them at the end of their Train the Trainer course, and I said, this is how your trainees are going to be feeling, and you really need to think about that and make them feel comfortable and happy to share their ideas. So how do we go about this then? How do we go about this gluing process? Well, I think, as Sarah was saying, getting people comfortable, and the personality of the trainer is so important in this. Getting there early, making sure you don't have a sort of anonymous Zoom message. The trainer will let you in now, the host will let you in. If you can't be there, then I always make sure there's a photograph, there's information, what do they need to download for the session, something that's friendly, something that makes them feel wanted. If you were in a classroom, you'd be there as they came in, you wouldn't be asking them to queue up outside. So I try and make it the same. I do use breakout rooms a lot. Right at the beginning, I was a bit scared of breakout rooms. And I think I was rather clunky a year ago using breakout rooms. What I loved in a classroom, of course, if people are doing an activity, is that you can sort of shimmy along behind them and just lend one ear. That's really hard in a breakout room. You feel like when you come in to check everything's all right, you're throwing the door open, aren't you? And everybody looks up in a shock. But I've learned that actually, especially on our longer courses, that we've got to get lots of breakout rooms really early on in lots of different varieties, group sizes, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 5 perhaps, so people can really get to know each other. Vary the activities, maybe just a 2-minute question, maybe a discussion. By the end of 2 weeks, they're working in small groups. Their final task is usually about an hour and a half. They're basically making a program or they're producing a live page on their own in a breakout room. We're there if they need us. They very rarely do. So they've discovered that sort of autonomy and bonded enough to be able to work together. So I keep looking back at all my courses and I keep thinking, I need more breakout rooms there. Physical activity. This was something that, only really occurred to me, I think, a few months ago. I was thinking in a classroom, we get people to move around. We might do exercises to loosen people up. They're always jumping up and down. They're always moving around the classroom, writing things on the wall, or I don't know, doing a piece to camera or something. So I was thinking we've got to try and get that in. So I just did, in the last course I just did this silly little warm-up thing where I said, this is my imaginary ball, and I threw my imaginary ball over to somebody in Nairobi, actually. And then I said, tell me one thing that you remember from yesterday's session. And then he threw it to somebody else in Myanmar, and then it was flying around the world, this imaginary ball, and it was fantastic. I don't know if I would do that on day one, but certainly, towards the end of a course, people felt very comfortable. We even had a guy in Cairo who had a basketball hoop behind him, and he was pretending that the ball had gone into the basketball hoop. I'd be very interested if anybody else does anything physical. If you could write in chat. Some of my trainers have talked about doing sort of desk yoga a bit to warm people up, or halfway through a session just to refresh something, rather than giving people a break, just stopping the input and saying, right, let's just do something physical. And then lastly, I set up a WhatsApp group. I tried so many things in terms of social learning and communities of practice. They just weren't working. Yammer wasn't working. Nobody went there. So I thought, well, I've got to go where they go. And they're on WhatsApp. So I set up a WhatsApp group. And, and I really did it so that they could just talk to each other, which they did. But what happened was that they started sharing content with each other, which was great. And also I started sharing content, key learning points with them. So what you can see on the screen here, this is another word cloud, another Mentimeter word cloud. So it was a revision of editorial values. I'd asked them to just write as many as they could remember on the screen. And I just posted that on the WhatsApp group, and they were all going, thank you, thank you, thank you. And then there was this wonderful golden comment from Raghav in Delhi, no way can we forget any of those values now. And I was thinking, oh, thank you so much. That's so wonderful. So I'd be very interested, has anybody else found something that really works in terms of bonding people and bringing them together? They're still, this finished, in April, this course, but they're still chatting to each other. They're still checking that they're okay. They're still saying, I saw this wonderful film or, news report, and sharing it with each other. So it's really worked for that group. But I'd be very interested what else has worked from everybody.
It's a really great question, Kath, and so nothing's come up in the chat on that question yet. But Rebecca says, with regards to the physicality, that she went to a session where the icebreaker was charades, which was quite amusing, and having to mime Game of Thrones was a level.
That's brave, yes.
Yeah, I'm not even sure where I go with that. And Helen says, I use Microsoft Teams as an internal forum where I share additional content following training, and participants and staff also share. So I really like, Kath, that you said, this idea of like, well, Yammer wasn't working and this wasn't working and that wasn't working, and Go where they go.
Are, yes.
So
yes.
important. And I must admit, I've stuck with email for a lot of stuff because so many of us live in email.
Yes.
And that recreating the physical experience, not slavishly so, but using the tech for a really good thing, a really good way, making the most of it. I love everything you've said there, Kath. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Really appreciate your input today. And this is all, I mean, Kath was talking about making things relevant, and Sarah, this is what you're going to be talking about as well for our next point.
Yes, thank you. I love that, Kath. Thank you so much. And I particularly enjoyed the bit about physicality, because it's just so easy to think we're fixed at our computers because, you know, our computer's on the desk, but there's so much more that we can do. So it's just brilliant to hear that. I love the basketball example. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay, so our second strategy is make it relevant. And this is all about helping to show why the content matters to our learners. Why should they be interested? Why is it worth them paying attention? What difference might it make to them? So it's all about showing the importance, but also helping them to think about how they'll apply the learning and actually use it in their work. So in practice, this could involve activities we give participants before, during, or after a live session, excuse me, to help them think about applying the learning or to reflect on their current practice. And it could be something really straightforward, like a self-reflection form that they complete in advance and bring with them. It could be exercises done before the virtual classroom. And then maybe participants are asked to bring discussion points or questions with them. And then during the virtual workshop, we could be asking them to identify core actions that they'll take away. So it might be another nice way we mentioned earlier with the quizzes to help keep them listening, because they need to identify their key actions, and we perhaps are going to ask them to share those at the end. And we can also think about embedding the learning. So are participants given opportunities to revisit and to refresh the ideas at a later date? Are there ways that we can encourage a follow-up? So maybe with a manager or a mentor or a peer to see how things are going with actually applying that learning. So I think we're going to, over to you, Jo, I think.
Thank you very much. And what we'd really like to know is what your examples are of this. What do you do to help participants apply their learning as part of the training? It's this learning transfer stuff. It's all very good to have a great session, but what do we actually do when we think about the context that you're in? And we're all going to be in different contexts, whether that's the platform, the industry, where our learners are, all sorts of different things. So what have you done to help apply that learning? Have you used self-reflection sheets or a workbook? Have you got people doing something similar to what Kath was talking about, which is maybe a WhatsApp group? Are people doing projects as they go along? So what is it that you've been doing? Now, Stacey, you've said do around at the end of takeaways, loving that. I always use the on-brand term of your lightbulb moments, which is really cheesy. But the whole point is thinking about what have I learned today and how am I going to apply that? And Stacey says they always get delegate notes, which is important. I think there's a fine balance between taking notes that are relevant to us and also making sure that we give people enough so that they don't have to panic about writing things down and can really immerse themselves in that learning. And Suzanne, no problem at all. Glad that you're resending that to all attendees. Mike says self, team and others to shape thinking and reflection. I really like that too. It's all like, well, what have I learned? But what can I apply to my team? What can I do for my learners, my attendees on my sessions? That kind of stuff. Helen says self-reflection sheets and share key learning points at the end. Thank you. We ran a big course recently and we had a workbook with loads of self-reflection questions in. Now, I'm pretty certain not everyone did all of those questions, but they were there so that people could think about, well, what did I observe today? And, you know, I've done this maybe pre-work, but what do I know that I need to focus on to develop this further? And Stephen says facilitated action learning sets, a long-winded way of saying, so what are you going to do now? And I really like that. It's all about getting together and making sure that we can apply it. One of the things we do in our courses is we run our 2-hour sessions of here's the content, it's interactive, it's discursive. But then actually we have a 1-hour session between those, which is then a little bit more about focusing on the kind of consultancy, focusing on making sure we kind of get to grips with things. Now, what I'd really like to know, please, from Owen is a little bit more about an example that you've got.
Great, thanks very much, Jo, and hello everybody this morning. It's great to be part of the webinar, and my role, as Jo said, really is to bring a few practical examples to bring to life things that we've been involved with at Acteon or that we know about that are good examples that hopefully bring some of these key strategies to life. So this first one really about making the learning relevant, like a lot of these things really, this is something we would always try to do. I mean, this is a key part of instructional design, is trying to make learning messages relevant. The challenge often is, how do we do that in a virtual environment, in the virtual classroom? So the example I want to share today really brings up this idea of, can participants bring something they're actually working on, a real task or a real problem of their own that's related to the training? Can they bring that into the classroom and work on it there? Then it's directly relevant to them, and they can also get support and input from their peers. So we've got an example from a client of ours. In this case, it's a large global manufacturing organization, and they are implementing lean manufacturing across their business. And there's lots and lots of training and support to help that process become embedded. A critical part of this is called leader standardized work, and that's a practice that managers have to learn to embed within their daily activities. Now, our client was using a face-to-face training exercise where managers actually build their own calendar as an interactive exercise as part of the training. So you can see a photograph here. This is actually a photograph from one of those training sessions, and managers are learning about leader standardized work. They're about learning about how to embed it in their daily and weekly procedures, and they're actually doing it. They're building their calendar with post-it notes on these boards, and the great thing is they get a chance to do that with their peers, with their colleagues, with the facilitator there. So it's directly relevant to their work and what they're doing. So when we work with our client to move this training into the virtual classroom, we really wanted to preserve this very practical, very relevant activity. And we did that using a virtual collaboration tool called Mural. You may well have come across a tool like Mural. It's a fantastic whiteboarding tool. And we recreated the exercise within this virtual whiteboarding tool. So managers still got the opportunity to build their calendar as part of the session. They still got the chance to share that with their peers, to work with their peers. And of course, at the end of it, they had built their calendar plan, something that they would go away, take away and use, as a lot of you flagged up in the chat about the importance of having that takeaway, something practical to follow up. So I think this is a really nice example of taking an activity that really builds relevance, that is actually practically relevant to that person, something maybe you're doing well in a classroom situation. You can take that into the virtual classroom and keep that relevance for the participants. So just one example there. So at that point, I'll hand back. I think, Sarah, we're going to move on to the next of our strategies.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Owen. It's a really interesting example. And I think it's worth saying that strategies 2 and 3 that we've just talked through, in particular, aren't things that are unique to the virtual classroom at all. These are things that we're used to doing in face-to-face learning. It's just perhaps we might need to think about how we bring them into the virtual environment and think a bit differently about ways to make that happen, and maybe not assume that we're more constrained in a virtual environment. So this third strategy is about bringing it to life, and this is where things can get really fun and interesting. We want to engage the audience with examples that help them to visualize theories and anchor concepts in practice. Why does that matter? Well, it really helps people to understand concepts much more clearly and empathize with the reality of a situation and perhaps its impact on other people. I think it also helps them to think beyond their own experience and hear other perspectives. And most importantly is that it makes the content much more memorable. So what are we talking about here? What might this involve? Well, it could be using case studies. So we're, again, really anchoring those ideas into real examples, situations. It might involve role plays. And it's worth thinking about how those happen. So maybe that's in pairs in breakout rooms, so it's a little bit less intimidating than role playing in front of a whole room. Or you might want that, I don't know. Scenario-based learning is a really interesting area that we're going to dig into in a moment, into an example. Storytelling, we talked about that right at the top with that idea of what makes a good teacher great. It's all about bringing ideas to life, having memorable ways that we engage with stories. That's such a human angle, isn't it? We love stories. And don't forget that you've got real living people. We've got real people in our virtual classrooms as our delegates. So let them speak, let them share their stories and experiences. I'm going to go back to Owen for an example.
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah. Yes, so Sarah, of course, has been talking about those things that we really know help learning experiences come to life and help humanize them. So it's case studies, it's scenarios, it's role play, it's storytelling. I think storytelling was something so many people picked up on in that very first question about what makes a great teacher. So how do we bring these things into the virtual classroom? Well, I'm going to share a practical example of this, and I've said this is not an example from Acteon's work. We've done lots of things like this, but I think this example is such a good one, brings these things together so well, I really want to use it. And it's actually from St George's Hospital in London, and it's used in the training of paramedics. So in medical training, and some of you may have had experience of this, role playing is often a significant part of that, sort of, doctor-patient or practitioner-patient interactions and so forth. And the team at St George's really wanted to be able to use this in their virtual classroom. And this is how they did it. So they had their role-playing actors, and they had those on camera and visible to everyone in the class. And the actors would play out a scene until they reached the decision point, the choice point. What should the practitioner do next? What should they say next? And so on. And the facilitator would provide options for the class, and the class would choose what happens next in the scenario. So how were they doing that? Well, we've heard it mentioned already this morning, but they used a simple tool called Mentimeter. You're probably familiar with this, or perhaps with apps like it. So Mentimeter is, it's a simple app that allows a facilitator to put out questions, surveys. We saw the word cloud examples that Kath had earlier, a simple way of collecting and collating input from the group. So the facilitator would use Mentimeter to give the choices to the audience at the end of the scenario. And the audience would decide what they thought was the appropriate decision, what the practitioner should do next. The facilitator could collect those responses, share them back with the group, and then the actors would act out the sequence that had been chosen by the class. So effectively what we have here is an interactive branching scenario carried out practically, but in the virtual classroom. So it's a really brilliant way. So that the class are actually building this story according to what they think should be happening. So it's really bringing the learning to life. It's really making the class active participants in that learning journey. And of course, the facilitator can fill in gaps. So if there are key choices that the class didn't choose, or sometimes where there are wrong answers, which are actually really helpful to the learning, then obviously the facilitator can control that a bit and get the actors to play certain scenes, perhaps that didn't come up otherwise. But really powerful and engaging training. We actually found out about this story from a colleague of ours who had trained as a paramedic and been through this experience. And she absolutely raved about it, and it was really powerful and effective and very engaging for the whole group. So a really neat example of thinking about how do we take these powerful things like case studies, scenarios, storytelling that bring learning to life, and how can we actually deliver those in a virtual classroom session? And if we can, it really works. Great, thanks. I'll go back to you, Sarah, on that point.
Great, thank you, Owen. I really like that example. And I think it's one of those classics that we were talking about things that we maybe would think about in face-to-face, we can still do in virtual if we kind of open up to the possibilities. Strategy 4 is holding attention. So this involves considering what the different distractions might be in a virtual context. So the likelihood is you've got learners who are in a different physical context than they would be for a face-to-face workshop. So they might be sitting at their desks, perhaps they've got their email still open, perhaps they've got their phone next to them. If they're at home, maybe they're going to be interrupted by the doorbell or have their dog barking or think they're just going to slip off and make a cup of tea. And we might, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we've probably all been into webinars where we've been a little bit guilty of doing things like that ourselves. In a virtual classroom, though, it's different. We really, really need to engage people. But we might also find that expectations are different. So maybe some participants have joined the session thinking they'll half listen, but they might just have a chance to write that urgent email that they need to finish off for this afternoon. And these are things that they wouldn't consider doing if they were coming into a face-to-face workshop. But you know, it makes the virtual environment kind of a little bit more challenging in some ways. So how can we use the virtual environment to our advantage to keep learners engaged? Well, there's so many different ways to do this, and I'm sure many of you are already doing these things. So please do type into the chat if you've had particular big wins for keeping participants focused. It'd be great to hear what those are. Have you had a particularly successful tactic you've used for holding attention? And I'll just share a few thoughts while you're typing. I think the most important thing here is that we start by prioritizing engagement in our session design, so that from the beginning, when we're designing, we think about how we're going to hold the attention of participants. And overcoming those distractions can be through making content bite-sized, keeping things short. I know Joe's rule of thumb is that we regularly ask for input and participation. We've got some kind of interaction every 3 to 5 minutes. And that doesn't have to be something very complicated. It could be something quite simple and straightforward. Holding the attention might involve changing pace maybe. So you might have some more reflective sections and some with higher energy. Or it could involve asking each person to complete a task as they listen. So that might be filling in a sheet. So again, they have to take responsibility for their own listening and learning rather than assuming someone else in their group is concentrating for them. And we've got loads of creative, engaging things at our fingertips when we're online, like videos, audio, music, all that kind of stuff. It's like being in a sweet shop. What can we use? Joe, are we getting some good examples in the chat?
So nothing's come up just yet. I'm sure people are going to be sharing some in a moment, but Isabel shared some research from LinkedIn that 73% of people on Zoom calls admit to doing something else, and maybe the other 27% just don't admit to it. I thought that was really interesting. So what do we do to keep people engaged? Frequent asks, says Christina. Absolutely, every 3 to 5 minutes, do something. Polls, using chat, the annotation tool, Kath says everybody loves. Suzanne says, let participants write and draw on the whiteboard. They love to scribble. It's so creative. Getting a response every 3 to 5 minutes, says Helen. Very, very good on that. Prompt them to unmute. Actually get them talking. Go and find an activity. Ask someone to unmute to do something and then nominate someone else. So it's not always us saying, Bob, you're next. It's that little bit of, oh, stressful jeopardy, who's going to be next? Maybe even something like a mindful exercise or stretching if energy is important. It obviously all depends on your learning outcomes, your audience, you as a facilitator. Even though I'm kind of into mindfulness and stretching, I'm not sure I've ever done that on a session. So it depends a lot on all of those different things. And certainly kind of building up those activities from anything like quick green tick if you've had this experience, use chat to tell me more, unmute, and so on. So crossword puzzles, let them present back to you. All these ideas are really good, Sarah, I think, and exactly the kind of thing you're talking about with holding attention. So Sarah, let's hear a little bit from Owen. Owen, how can we change all this up?
Great, thanks, Joe. Well, absolutely. By doing all of those things that people are sharing in chat, and that's absolutely right, using annotations, getting interactions from your audience and doing that regularly. I've just got 3 other quick ideas that you can try if you're not using them already. And they're all quite simple and all something which you can pretty much implement yourself and use in almost any virtual classroom scenario. So the first one is keep up the visual interest. And this is something that was commented on early on. I think Stephen mentioned it, using images to prompt attention. So if you're doing a plenary type presentation where you've got to present to the group, and you probably will have to do this as part of a lot of virtual classroom training, you're probably going to be using more visuals than you would for a typical face-to-face session. In a physical classroom, your audience is more captive, and they've also got you as a visible distraction as well. So, but in the virtual classroom, you need to keep up that visual interest, use more images, transition between them a bit more rapidly, and don't be afraid to drop in the odd surprise to provoke a response from your audience. Okay, so use your visuals as a way of holding attention. Great. So example number 2, and this is your moment, Derek. I think Derek mentioned at the start using sound as well, and we absolutely agree with that at Acteon. So using sound to add variety and to maintain engagement. So that could be meaningful sound that's actually related to the learning objectives that you have, maybe in video, in podcasts or something like that. Maybe there are sounds, acoustic sounds that are relevant to the learning message. Or it might just be audio prompts to provoke curiosity and to capture attention. An example of this is recently my colleague James Woodman and I gave a webinar about using music to enhance learning in general. So of course the obvious thing to do for that webinar was to create a radio jingle. And I'm afraid we did do that. And unfortunately we're going to unleash it on you now. So Sarah, if you wouldn't mind just...
It's James and Owen's webinar. Sit back and relax wherever you are. Burnley, Bristol or the Isle of Hoy. We'll be dropping some beats that we hope you'll enjoy.
Okay, apologies for that. Even if you're only half listening to the webinar, you're not going to be able to unhear that for a while. But actually, we used that jingle at various points throughout the webinar. It was a great prompt at holding attention. It created quite a lot of conversation and chat in itself. But it just makes that point really about using audio sometimes as to provoke surprise, to provoke curiosity and keep people's attention. Okay, so the third quick idea to try, and these have been mentioned already really, and it's just the power of the quiz for holding attention. You know, we're instinctively curious. A lot of people are quite competitive. People like quizzes, I think. And there's all sorts of ways that you can use them. So you might use them quite informally, you know, where you're just throwing out questions and maybe you're capturing answers and responses in chat, and you're just using that to keep a learning session moving along. Or it could be something much more structured and formal. You might be using a competitive quiz with an interactive tool and so on, or anything in between. But quizzes can be a really powerful way of holding attention. So we just thought we'd share a very quick example from our work. This is an interactive quiz that we created for a pharmaceutical client that we work with, and it's used in virtual classroom sessions for training sales reps. And essentially it's helping to deliver what are really some quite dry product knowledge facts that reps just have to retain. And so we set those facts into a competitive quiz, and we added a bit of jeopardy by the fact that not only do you make your answers, but you also effectively gamble on how confident you are in those answers by dragging the appropriate vial into place. So it's competitive, there's a leaderboard that runs throughout, and that was perfect for this audience of highly competitive sales reps. And it just helped to hold attention through what was some quite dry training material. So 3 quick ideas there. Use more visuals if you're in a kind of plenary session where you're talking to the group. Think about using audio to capture attention, to hold attention, and never underestimate the power of a quiz. So thanks, Sarah. Back to you.
I think we just had some questions in chat there for you. Joe, would you like to share those?
Yeah, so some people accepting your apology for the audio, which was quite funny. But I mean, the main question we had from James was, how was the jingle created? So especially for the non-creatives among us.
Yeah, I'm surprised you didn't recognise James and I falsetto voices on that. No, we at Acteon, we really do believe in the power of music in learning. We do quite a lot of work with that, including creating bespoke songs and so forth as part of learning messages. And so we have a very good relationship with a production studio, actually happen to be based in Manchester, who specialise in this sort of work, and a lot of their work is producing jingles. So shortly before that webinar, when we came up with the idea, we threw down the words, sent it to our friends at the studio and said, please can you make us the cheesiest radio jingle you can come up with to deliver this message. So that's the short answer to how we did that. But generally, you know, I mean, there is a certain production element there. It is something you can kind of do by yourself if you know somebody who has some experience of you know, basic experience with music and production, as a lot of amateurs do. But certainly worth looking into, I think. Just generally that idea of using music. I mean, we did a whole webinar on it for the Learning and Skills group. And yeah, really, we do believe in the power of music for building retention of information, retention and recall. It's a very powerful way of doing it.
Thank you, Owen. Now, Sarah, we need to quickly move on to valuing people's time, because we are running out of time on our webinar.
We are. Okay, so this final 5th strategy is about really thinking how we make the most of the contact time when we brought people together. This time is really valuable. This is the time when we can make the most of the opportunity for that human element of discussion, interaction, exploring ideas, sharing experiences. So ideally, if we can manage it, can we use this time less for new information delivery and more for digging into those ideas together? So this is the flipped classroom approach, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So where new information is given out in advance with pre-session exercises, reading, or activities that participants are asked to complete. And then the virtual classroom is the point at which we come together to discuss and reflect on those. And we can also think about what we do after a live session. So with follow-up resources, or perhaps learning nudges to help participants implement and integrate that new practice into their work. And it could also include the ideas we talked about earlier for having opportunities to kind of revisit and refresh, embed the learning, maybe have follow-up check-ins with a manager or a mentor. I think if you're providing multiple workshop sessions, perhaps there are activities that you could set for people in a first workshop, and they go away and do themselves and practice or try out or apply, and then they come back together to share what happened, share their insights from that. So again, I think over to Owen, we've got an example of how things were kind of rethought for the time that's used in the virtual classroom.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I'll just whiz through this one because I know we're nearly at the end of the session. So I think what we're really talking about here is just revisiting the instructional design of materials to make the most of the human interaction that's possible in the virtual classroom. So what's best done together as a group, what's best done as self-study or individually, and trying to get that balance right. So here's just a final quick practical example of Acteon. So another large multi-site organization, again involved in quite complex technical processes, and as part of their work, many of their employees needed to be able to use formal problem-solving processes. And our client used to introduce employees to the formal approaches to problem solving using a pretty full-on day-long classroom course. And what you can see here is actually the actual agenda of that course. It was a good day, well-designed, mixture of kind of plenary sessions, practical case studies, group case studies. So it was a good piece of face-to-face training. With the onset of COVID, our client needed to take this into the virtual environment. And so we took the opportunity to work with them to redesign it, to try to make the most of the virtual classroom And so what we looked at, is what elements of this are going to work really well as self-study, what elements can be done as informal group work, and where are we going to get the most benefit from facilitated classroom sessions. And the outcome looked a bit like this. I'll just whiz through this. So a couple of abbreviations to explain. A VILT is a virtual instructor-led training, which is our client's acronym for the virtual classroom. And just what you see down there, OJD at the bottom, that's on the job development and coaching, which happens after the training, the formal training has finished. So we start the session with a virtual classroom, and that's about getting the group together. That's about helping them be introduced to each other. It's their chance to share their previous experience of problem-solving techniques. It's a chance to set expectations for the course, and crucially, it's a chance to organize themselves into subgroups, which they need for a bit later on. They then work through some structured self-study delivered as e-learnings. This is, I guess you could say, the sort of pre-working, but it's really where they learn about the formal process and they get a chance to see that in action through a couple of case studies. Then, in their small informal groups, they actually work together to do a problem-solving case study. And they do this quite informally. They just do it on Teams together. They organize it in their own time, and they spend an hour doing that, and they capture their outcomes as a presentation that they deliver back into the summary virtual classroom session. So this is the session where people come back together, they have a chance to share the results of their problem solving, to share their experiences of the course, and the facilitator can help to fill in any gaps and work together to really reinforce the key learning outcomes and the takeaways that will be embedded through the on-the-job development and coaching. So just a quick example through something, I'm sure we're all familiar with, but hopefully bringing it to life to show how can we revisit instructional design to make the most of the human interaction and collaboration possible in the virtual classroom. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Owen. So I'm just going to summarise the 5 strategies we've talked about. If there's a particular thought, idea, or something that's come up that that is your kind of key takeaway, then please share that in the chat while I'm just going through these. So just to summarise our 5 strategies, we've talked about fostering collaboration, fostering participation and connection, helping people to feel comfortable and ready to learn, and really encouraging that connection, that collaboration. We heard some wonderful insights from Kath at the BBC around that. Thank you, Kath. Then we talked about how to make it relevant. So helping participants think about how they'll actually use the learning in their work and giving them tools and tactics for doing that. And then bringing it to life, making it real. So this was about using case studies, examples, stories, that wonderful example of scenario-based learning to make things much more memorable. We talked about holding attention, so acknowledging the different distractions that we have in virtual environments and ways we can keep participants focused with all sorts of creative methods for doing that. And finally, the 5th strategy is how we might use the time in a really people-centric way. So perhaps taking a flipped classroom approach and moving the delivery of new information to other resources before the session, using the virtual classroom time for discussion and interaction. Have we had other comments from the chat, Jo, that you'd like to share?
Absolutely. So some good conversation going on about how do we get them to do the pre-work because they tell us it's good. And there's lots of ideas in chat you can have a look at. In terms of reflections, we're thinking about we've used videos but not sound. So maybe specifically using a different media, which can be good. Not holding people in a waiting room and add surprising images or sounds and using their case studies, not mine, so getting people really involved that way. I've never tried using music, so giving that a go. You do have to be careful about copyright, so just make sure you look that up. And spend even more time thinking through options and being creative. Absolutely brilliant. And what's your final thought, Sarah, to finish us off with?
Yeah, brilliant. So just want to bring us back to the story of the apple, because what we're really talking about is how we engage with people on a human level and the importance of things that are very much about social interactions. So it's all about putting people at ease, building that rapport, making it comfortable to share ideas and using stories to bring ideas to life. We've talked about that a few times. We want to encourage people to collaborate, to work together, to connect. We heard that from Kath with the WhatsApp example. So can we still find these human connections in virtual environments? Absolutely, I think we can. And when it comes to design and delivery of virtual learning, I think we all need to be asking, where are our apples? So thank you, everybody, for your brilliant contributions in chat today. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Kath for her input. We really appreciate it, and to Owen for those examples, and to Joe for keeping us all kind of running smoothly. And please do feel free to contact me or Owen on these emails. And we've got the white paper that discusses all of these that you can download on that link, and we will share it in a follow-up email. So back over to you, Joe, to round off.
Well, thank you very much, absolutely, to everyone for all of your input, including, of course, Sarah, Owen and Kath. So thank you very much for your time today. You can go and download that white paper. I've put the link in chat. It's on the breeio.com website. We look forward to seeing you in a webinar in the future. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye, everyone.